Our story begins on the planet of Alderaan, 1 hour before its destruction. Bale had already been made aware of the Death Star wiping out Jeddah City just so it could wipe out Sword's rebel partisans and the entire rebel and Imperial army on Scarif. If the Empire is happy to use this massive moon-looking space station to kill their own military personnel and rebel infantry, what would stop them from blowing up a planet like Alderaan that is perceived as peaceful as far as the Empire was aware? Plus, the Empire made it clear to Bale that they were okay with killing any civilian. So when the Death Star showed up, Bale began to evacuate his people immediately. He didn't know how much time he had left to escape, but what he did know was that he fully committed to the rebellion now and couldn't go back to the Senate. Time was running out, but Bale already had a fleet of 7 CR-70 corvettes, 13 CR-90 corvettes, 20 Sphyrna-class Hammerhead corvettes, and 200 Alderanian transport ships to get as many people on board as possible. They flew their ships into the outer space and out of range of the Death Star's firing range. And when they had just escaped the planet, other transport ships that were boarding their people were still on the planet and would unfortunately be wiped out as the Death Star struck the planet, and Bale, the Alderanian resistance, and the civilians that had escaped would be devastated as they saw their planet and their people be destroyed. But they would jump to hyperspace immediately before they could perish like the rest of their people. It was a truly devastating loss on such a large scale. Bale and his fleet would arrive at Yavin 4 2 hours after Alderaan was destroyed, so they would make it just in the nick of time, and Bale would warn the Rebel Alliance that the Death Star had just destroyed Alderaan, and that its full capability was that it could destroy an entire planet at full power. The rebels were shocked by this, and they needed a plan to destroy the Death Star immediately. Bale asked where Leia was, but they didn't know. This was concerning for Bale, but he needed to focus on the threat at hand. He believed that they would eventually get caught, so he ordered their evacuation immediately. The rest of the events of Episode 4 would play out similarly. The difference was that the fleet had already evacuated, and Leia would still be rescued and would be taken back to Yavin 4, and Luke Skywalker would still destroy the Death Star. After that, the remaining crew got on their ships and they all jumped to hyperspace, which they would find the planet of Hoth, where they would build a rebel base at. And on the way, General Dodana and Leia would be able to update Bale on everything that had happened, and they found out that the Imperial Senate was dismantled. This concerned Bale heavily, as he could have revealed the Death Star to the Imperial Senate and the galaxy. It would be 3 years where the rebels would plan for the Empire to eventually find their base on Hoth, to which they would hide their fleet in asteroids nearby to wipe out the fleet that would come, so they could hopefully gain an advantage over the Empire, and they were right. A probe droid would find the rebel base, and the first Imperial Star Destroyer would be destroyed from the base's cannon, but it would need to be recharged, so they needed time to recharge it. Darth Vader's fleet would arrive, but the moment they jumped out of hyperspace, they had to deal with 77 rebel naval vessels, made up of 30 transports, 43 corvettes, 2 frigates, 1 Lucrehulk-class battleship that they didn't use on Yavin 4, and 1 MC-80 Star Cruiser. It was a small fleet, but it was bigger than the Imperial fleet, although they would have to fight an Executor-class Star Dreadnought / Super Star Destroyer. They would, however, attack the Imperial fleet, and all they had to do was hold out, as they had called for 3 out of 35 rebel fleet lines to come and assist them, as this attack could potentially benefit the Alliance more. The reason why they had so many fleets was because Bale suggested that they didn't try to take the mid-rim with these fleets, like the Rebel Alliance had originally planned to, as it was just too risky in Bale's eyes. The battle began, and the fleet would try to destroy the Imperial fleet, and the Hoth base cannon would begin to disable Imperial Star Destroyers. Luckily, there was only 9, but the rebels would have to fight 1,408 TIE fighters, 96 TIE interceptors, and 96 TIE bombers, as well as 69 shuttles that were being launched from the Imperial Star Destroyer's hangars. Then they were being led by Darth Vader. While the space battle was taking place, General Veers was leading a ground force of 290 AT-AT walkers, 295 AT-ST walkers, 6 all-terrain personal transports, 8 all-terrain advanced raiders, 120 K-79 S-80 Imperial troop transports, and 10 HCVW A-9 turbo tanks, which would be able to crush the rebel forces on the ground. They also had a large infantry number of 132,540 snowtroopers, which would prove difficult for the Rebel Alliance. Also, the Empire thought. What they didn't know was that the ambush fleet consisted of 1,068 X-Wing starfighters, 549 A-Wing interceptors, and 112 Y-Wing bombers, ready to wipe out the Imperial fleet. Vader decided to have 1,400 TIE fighters, 90 TIE interceptors, and 90 TIE bombers attack the fleet head-on, while the rest followed him as his personal squadron started to destroy the starships. And so the battle truly began. 68 X-Wings and 49 A-Wings would defend the naval ships and fight Vader's squadron, while the rest would tear down the TIE series fighters, interceptors, and bombers. The Rebel squadrons were successfully tearing down the TIE series fleet because the Rebel X-Wings were more advanced and they had more than the TIE fighters that didn't have shields. Darth Vader was starting to attack the Lucrehulk to devastate the rebels, but luckily they had already gotten all the troops on the ground, to which they had close to 3 times the amount of the Imperial Snowtrooper army, which the rebels' army consisted of 344,400 rebel troopers on Hoth to fight back against the Empire. They didn't have many ground vehicles, however, but their LAAT gunships would be a great assist to the ground army. The fighting would go on for hours, and the rebels would do everything they could to jam the Empire's transmissions, so they had enough time to escape before reinforcements could arrive. The base cannon had managed to disable a Star Destroyer, so the naval fleet would fire at it, destroying the vessel. Vader, however, managed to destroy their Lucrehulk, which was a problem to the rebels, but he did sacrifice a good portion of his squadron, and the X-Wings and A-Wings were tearing down the other TIE fighters and interceptors. After 3 hours of fighting, most of the TIE fighters and interceptors were destroyed, while on the ground, 305 gunships were shot down, but they would destroy 200 AT-AT walkers, as this was their main focus, while the ground tanks and turrets managed to destroy 7 AT-ST walkers, but they would lose most of the tanks, and they didn't have many to begin with, so that left them with 1 speeder tank left. The rebels also managed to kill 100,000 snowtroopers while losing 151,000 of their troopers. They had a better chance because the walkers were too distracted by the gunships, which allowed the snow speeders to pull down another 13 AT-AT walkers, and give the rebels the chance and ability to kill off so many snowtroopers. While this was happening, the Y-Wing bombers managed to have enough time to destroy the Executor's engines, and they would destroy the engines so it couldn't escape. And after losing 41 Y-Wing bombers, they would be too much for the Dreadnought, and they would successfully destroy it, which boosted Alliance morale higher than it ever could be. Bale, who was actually on the planet of Hoth, was concerned with how things were going, even though they destroyed 3 Imperial Star Destroyers, 800 TIE Fighters, 30 Interceptors, and they started to cut down 22 TIE Bombers. The problem was that the Rebel Alliance had still lost 300 X-Wings and 90 A-Wings just to destroy most of the Imperial fleet. The other issue was that they didn't know if they could keep jamming the Empire's communications, as they had secretly placed jamming devices on the asteroids in the asteroid field near the planet. but they were worried that the Empire might eventually find them and destroy them all. However, the shield generator was in danger because the Imperial walkers were getting closer to the trenches, which would get them extremely close to the right firing range they needed. But luckily for Bail and the rebels, the end of the Imperial fleet had just begun. Their reinforcements finally arrived, which consisted of 3 MC-80A heavy-type cruisers, 6 MC-80 Liberty-type star cruisers, 21 Nebulon B-class frigates, and 27 CR-90 corvettes, with an air force of 594 X-Wing starfighters, 261 A-Wing interceptors, 120 B-Wing starfighters, 72 Y-Wing bombers, and 207 U-Wing gunships, and a ground force of 28,575 rebel troopers. While it wasn't as big as the army they had on Hoth before the battle, this would be what they needed to reinforce their exhausted army. The remaining TIE fighters and interceptors, as well as 30 TIE bombers and 4 Imperial Star Destroyers, would be destroyed in the next 2 hours. The Rebel Alliance would lose an MC-80A Star Cruiser and 2 Nebulons due to the bombers and Vader's crippling squadron. The Rebels would lose 23 X-Wings, 29 A-Wings, and 7 B-Wings, but the B-Wings' lasers would help to wipe out the remaining TIE fighters, and Vader would become too overwhelmed and a little distracted when Luke came out of the planet in his X-Wing starfighter, the Red 5. Vader would perish in the battle thanks to Luke and Red Squadron. On the ground, it would be an hour, and the U-Wing gunships and the LAAT gunships would focus on the AT-ST walkers, troop transports, shuttles, dropships, and AT-AT walkers, and destroy all the walkers, but they would lose their remaining speeders and speeder tank. But the LAATs would get a chance to destroy the Juggernaut tanks with their rockets, and the ground battle would be won, and the Imperials that remained would surrender. However, what they didn't know was that 2 Victory-class frigates in the early stages of the battle managed to escape Hoth before they got destroyed. The 2 frigates would make it to Coruscant and alert the Emperor that a massive rebel army residing on the planet of Hoth had eliminated Vader's fleet, including Vader himself, or so they believed. Palpatine's smile that he had before hearing this news turned into an impossible to contain face of extreme rage, knowing that he had just lost an important asset, his apprentice. He would need to find Luke Skywalker or use someone else because he lost all of his Inquisitors. He did have someone else in reserve and realized that she might just be his only option for now, until he could find another Force user. Because the problem was that Starkiller was already his enemy, and he was more of a secret apprentice of Darth Vader, so he couldn't use Starkiller. There weren't many Jedi left, and the holocron that contained all the information of Padawans and younglings and things were destroyed by Vader. So he called for his reserve apprentice, Mara Jade, who would arrive within the hour. Mara Jade had been doing smuggling work while awaiting new orders from Palpatine. Palpatine tasked her with capturing Luke Skywalker and bringing him to Palpatine. While he was planning on using her as an apprentice, he believed Luke would be a better candidate. Otherwise, he would have him killed and they could go from there. Luke would go to Dagobah to complete his training while the Rebel Alliance prepared for round 2 of their mid-rim offensive that they had planned, as they already had the Outer Rim on their side. Mara Jade traveled all across the galaxy trying to find Luke, but wouldn't be able to be a problem to the Rebel Alliance because Luke was away from them. Besides, they had a mid-rim offensive to win anyways. The way they decided to do this was to get Bail Organa to send information out to the galaxy about the Death Star and what it did to Alderaan, and the galaxy were furious with Palpatine. Palpatine would need Luke Skywalker to watch the Rebel Alliance and his friends burn, and because the second Death Star was in full production, he knew they would find out about their new toy, and the Rebel Alliance would want to destroy it. It was a perfect plan in his mind to get the galaxy back on track and back on his side. Luke would complete his training and would be stronger and wiser than ever thanks to Master Yoda's teachings. Unfortunately, by this time, Yoda had passed away, which was heartbreaking for Bail as he was good friends with Yoda. He felt the same heartbreak when he found out that Obi-Wan sacrificed himself to fight Darth Vader on the Death Star, and he found shame in having to kill Anakin at the Battle of Hoth, so he would put an end to Palpatine's reign once and for all. He already had a plan that Palpatine didn't know of, so the rebels found out about a second Death Star that had been in construction and that the Emperor was aboard this new space station. Unfortunately, many did die to get this information, but they would set off to Endor to put an end to the Emperor, with a ground army going down to take the planet and disable the shield generator. But when they arrived, they found a massive Imperial fleet that was prepared for them, as the rebels found out at that moment that they walked right into a trap and that Palpatine intentionally gave them that information so he could wipe them out in one fell swoop. Luke would fly his X-Wing onto the second Death Star because Palpatine allowed him to enter, and the battle began. Fleets were clashing and ships, starfighters, ground vehicles and soldiers were falling one by one on both sides, with the Empire gaining a foothold. It was hard when the rebels found out that this new Death Star destroyed naval ships and not planets after it destroyed an MC-80 Liberty Starcruiser. When Luke boarded the Death Star, he finally met Mara Jade, who brought him to Palpatine, and Palpatine showed him a dying rebel fleet, which Palpatine thought he could turn Luke to the dark side by showing him this dying fleet. But Luke was prepared to kill Palpatine, but his lightsaber strike was blocked by Mara Jade, and their lightsabers clashed as heavy and as hard-hitting as the fleets outside. When all hope seemed lost for the rebels, Bail smiled and said to himself, "This ends now, Palpatine. Admiral Akbar, launch the trap." To which Admiral Akbar would do what Bail did on Hoth and call for the fleets to arrive, to which 20 line fleets and other fleets of people from across the galaxy would come to their aid thanks to Bail's secret plan, where he changed up the mid-rim offensive idea. Instead of spreading the fleet out to attack the Empire, he encouraged people to rise up against the Empire in the mid-rim, which allowed them to spread into the other 6 regions of the known galaxy. So the new battle began, and the rebels were starting to beat back the Empire, and the Empire beat back the rebels, and it went back and forth on both space and ground until the rebels ultimately won. On the Death Star, Luke would beat Mara Jade and would offer her to have a better chance to live instead of killing her. But she said that her mission was to kill Luke, so he used his intelligence to his advantage and would tell Mara that her mission was already completed, which she got confused by what he meant, and Luke would take the advantage to disarm her and knock her out. To which he turned his attention to Palpatine, who laughed maniacally, and would attempt to electrocute Luke, but he would block it with his lightsaber and continue to fight Palpatine, and would eventually strike him down, and threw him down the side to make him explode so no one could ever bring him back. After nearly 3 decades, the Empire would finally crumble from the cracks in their system that finally showed, and the Rebel Alliance would eventually defeat them at the Battle of Jakku, and would officially become the New Republic. Bail would be elected as the Chancellor for his care and desire for freedom and equality for the galaxy. He would not demilitarize, but would instead keep an eye out on the Imperial remnants and other threats in the unknown regions, and would defeat them all over time, as well as Jabba and the other criminal syndicates. While it took them a long time, it was worth it in the end. Leia and Luke would learn about their father from Bail, but Leia would always recognize herself as an Organa. Han would eventually get Bail's blessing to marry Leia, as he helped save the galaxy. Luke would rebuild the Jedi Temple, but would allow attachments and for his students to see their families thanks to the help of Cal Kestis' advice. Bale would be able to look at his people that survived and kept their population alive, and would look at the galaxy that he was proud of, as he felt nothing but gratitude that he was able to escape Alderaan to save the galaxy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Whew, that was quite a big one. It was so much fun to make. Now let's get into this story, shall we? So a lot happened in this story, actually. I originally planned for the mid-rim offensive to just be an attack, just like it was in canon, I think it was. But I actually just decided, no, I'm just gonna keep it small, because I'm gonna use the mid-rim offensive for another Star Wars What If story. I also feel like if Bale survived, the Rebel Alliance would be able to use better tactics, like their one at Hoth. I couldn't go into full details. It's already been explored on Penta Patrol Star Wars. But I wanted to kind of just use the information from Wikipedia on canon and legends towards like their navy, their army, and air force. And I kind of just went from there. But it was so good to be able to write a story. And if you guys ever have any ideas for a what if story, please let me know. I do canon, legends, legacy, and I'll even do crossovers. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the story. You guys are awesome, and you have been watching the Alternate Star Wars Galaxy.